We have a fantastic panel of young clinician scientists, and they're going to tell you about their story, each in about 5 minutes, apart from Justin, because you've already heard his. And then it's really up to you. Loads of questions, ask whatever you want, and we'll get the panel to comment. And we've got a lot of time, and that's on purpose, because this is often the favourite part of the attendees. Enjoy this section the most. So let's start off, and first I'll introduce Dr. Ruth Mitchell.
Hello, it's a real honour and a privilege to be here, and I'm really grateful for an opportunity to actually reflect a little bit on my journey, which I feel I'm at the beginning of really as a clinician scientist. My clinical work is as a neurosurgery registrar, so I'm in the 5th year of a 6-year training program. I work at the Royal Melbourne Hospital at the moment. I've worked at the Royal Children's Hospital, at the Alfred, in Sydney at St George and Westmead Hospitals. I went to medical school in Adelaide actually, at Flinders, and I did my intern year at Flinders as well. So one of the features of life as a surgical trainee is a lot of moving around. Many of the training programs in surgery in Australia and New Zealand are such small programs that they're actually binational training programs. So although I haven't worked in New Zealand, a lot of my colleagues have moved back and forth across the ditch. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about your future directions. If you'd like to really get to know all over this country and also our neighbours, surgery is good for that actually. And you develop a broad network. And my research interests, my most significant research interest is in structural biology. So I'm just finishing up my PhD at the moment at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in the Structural Biology Division. And that was really motivated by getting very frustrated and quite depressed about the outcomes for my patients with aggressive brain tumours, with glioblastoma in particular. I got to a point where the weight of telling a family that this was the tumour that was going to limit their loved one's life, it just became too great to do nothing about it except for yet another family meeting, yet another operation, yet another referral to radiation oncology, medical oncology. I wanted to be able to shift the dial for my patients. And I can't say I've done that yet, but I've had an amazing adventure learning about the structure and function of the epidermal growth factor receptor. And I've kind of fallen in love with science in a way that I don't think I thought I was going to at the beginning. I thought I was going to do something useful and functional. I think I've been astounded by the wonder that I've found on the journey of really going deep with a single protein. And I encourage you to use your imagination to think about what might happen for you, what it might feel like for you to find something that you kind of fall in love with that way. And the other part of my life, I suppose, is that I've probably since I came out of the womb, I've been an activist. And sort of my parents recall that at the age of 5, I was, very much encouraging everyone around the waste in the playground. I probably would have just defined myself as a feminist as early as sort of 10 or 11, and been collecting signatures for campaigns since about 12 or 13. And so it probably wasn't terribly surprising to my parents that when I was in medical school, I got very involved in anti-nuclear work, and I was around to help start the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which very excitedly led last year to us getting a treaty through the United Nations to ban nuclear weapons. And that's why I get to put on my CV that I've won a Nobel Peace Prize, which I never thought I'd be able to say. So you never know what the future will hold for you if you actually do the things that you're passionate about and the things that you love. It's quite a change now. Everyone wants to talk to me about that, because for 10 years they're just like, oh, she's kind of a hippie. So it's amazing how things can change. It's still kind of true. So that's probably about enough about me. So.
Thanks. I don't know how I can follow that, really. My name's Joe Doyle. I'm an infectious diseases physician and a public health physician as well. And I work at Monash Uni and the Alfred Hospital, and I also have a research role at the Burnet Institute. And so my work and clinical work and research is mostly around hepatitis C, hepatitis B, and HIV. And these are chronic infections which actually, with hepatitis C, we can now cure. And that's all happened just in the last, really changed and transformed in the last 4 or 5 years. So my clinical and research career has been at an amazing time when we've gone from working out how to give people poisonous drugs in the easiest way to try and treat the hepatitis C to now giving them curative therapy really simply, but making sure that everybody can get it, because there's hundreds of thousands of people living with this sort of problem and they don't all get access to therapy. And there are 70 million people in the world who have hepatitis C. So my work has now changed from being more, still doing clinical trials and clinical studies to try and work out how to get treatments to the people who need it, but really now looking at the population impact. So in Australia, we have a national program now to eliminate Hep C, and we've got a big partnership across the country to try and do that, and we also try to translate that across our region as well. So I guess the question might come now is how I got there, and I think that I was reflecting that it's now more than half my life that I've been on this journey. So I started university in 1996, so you can work things out backwards a little bit, but I went to Melbourne Uni and did the old degree at Melbourne Uni, where you did 3 years undergraduate, all that sort of basic science stuff before you went off and did your 3 years in the hospital. And I have to admit that at that stage, I wasn't completely convinced that I was going to end up as a clinician, after those 3 years of basic science stuff, which ironically, after a newer degree, and some of you are doing biomedicine, you're sort of back to what I was doing, but I wasn't sure at that point. So I actually did an arts degree as well. And I did an honours in health politics, and it was doing politics where I looked actually at how the political process of HIV policy making in Australia, but I thought that infectious diseases was going to be that thing that straddled my interest in public policy and politics and clinical medicine and population health. And I think that's what seeded things back in the late 90s for me. So then if you skip forward, we all know you've got to do 6 or 7 years of training, but I did go to London along the way to do my Masters of Public Health, and that was a really great year. That was before we had kids. That's the sort of thing you do. And so my wife, not current, gee, what am I saying? I only got one. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, and I went to London. She worked in hospitals there. She's a doctor too. So she got to support me whilst I was doing my Masters. We had a great year. That was a real sort of fun time, as well as starting to bring together clinical medicine and public health. And when I came back, I did all of my exams and what have you. But whilst I was a registrar, we had our first child in 2010, and we've now got 4 kids. So, and my wife works full-time now as well, and she's a geriatrician. So we have this interesting balance at our house of who's doing what when, and we have a whiteboard that goes out which is photographed and goes out to the whole family every Friday for the whole week coming up to schedule our lives. And so I think my journey is one not just of medicine, but of, how you balance that, work and life and have a family. And we managed to start our kids, and my wife managed to, have her kids while she was doing a training as well. So that's certainly something that I think we really, as a society, need to be encouraging, because you don't want to wait till you come out the other end as a sort of mid to late 30s, and if you're a postgraduate even later, to start thinking about family. It's not practical. So we tried, and we managed to do both work and life along the way. Oh, good question, beg your pardon. So I did finished my PhD, and I'm at the last year of my postdoc. And for the next few years, I'll be continuing, because I'll be on another fellowship, career development fellowship, for the next 4 years. So I'm sort of in that transition from sort of trying to work with a group to starting my own group.
I think, can you hear me? All right, yeah. Terrific. So my name's Kirsten Perrett, and I think I'm here to show you a bit more of that journey that Joe's just told you about in his family life. And I guess that's really what I want to tell you guys, is that when I was your age and stage, I thought I was going to go on this trajectory, and really life is all through ups and downs, and you don't know at this stage what it's going to look like, and that's half the excitement of it. So just remember that life is a journey and not a sprint, and make sure that you make the most of the opportunities when they come up. So for me, I did medicine at Monash, and in 5th year I went and did my elective in Western Samoa, and that was a turning point for me, because working with so many children just cemented in me that I wanted to try and help children and work in paediatrics and try and change the trajectory there. And that was fabulous because I knew what I wanted to do. So I came back, finished med, did my internship in my first year of PEDS. And by that stage, I was already married. So that's pretty young, I guess. And my husband and I decided we wanted to go and have a year off and see the world and do something different. So we actually went and worked with the Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development program. Some of you may know about it or look it up for those people 18 to 30 who want to go and work in the developing world for a little bit. And that was absolutely fabulous. We went to Mongolia and worked in Ulaanbaatar, and I was at the maternal child hospital there. And that was a time where my eyes were on stalks. You know, there was a whole hospital for kids with tuberculosis, another one for those with measles. There was a full ward of children with hepatitis B, chronic hepatitis B, and dying of hepatitis B in their teenage years. And I really sort of got this enthusiasm for doing something about vaccine-preventable diseases. And that was when we came back and finished off did my FRSP exams, that I thought I would go into infectious diseases. The first spanner then was thrown into the works because my husband's also professional but in business, and he needed to go to the UK. So I looked around for opportunities and went and joined the Oxford Vaccine Group. He was in London. Of course, we had to live in Oxford and he had to commute, not me, because Oxford was a great place to live. But that was absolutely amazing because I was just immersed in academic life, and I just got the bug, and I started my PhD in Oxford and worked in clinical trials there, and it was absolutely fantastic. And if I can't encourage you enough to go and seek out those opportunities to go and work overseas, I'm sure you've heard that from other people today, that is something you should all do. So our first child was born in Oxford. Again, because of my husband's work, we had to come back to Melbourne, and I was only part way through my PhD. And that was a very difficult time because I was finishing my PhD, doing my advanced training, and then had twins. So that is another complication. You don't know what life is going to throw at you, but you just have to roll with it. And, they're beautiful 10-year-olds now. So then I got an NHMRC Early Career Fellowship and worked in the vaccine clinical trial group at the Murdoch. Again, was terrific, and was lucky enough to get a postdoc experience. But again, had to follow my husband to the US this time, and where he needed to be in Silicon Valley. But I was again privileged to be able to work with at Stanford in their vaccine trials group there. So I had no idea any of this would happen. You know, my husband sort of forced me to go overseas with his work, but I fell on my feet. And you just look out for those opportunities and talk to people. And by going overseas, you realise just how small the world is and how wonderful it is to collaborate with people everywhere. We did have another baby in the US, and then we're back home here now, and I work in the Melbourne Children's Trials Centre and the Population Allergy Group at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and absolutely love being a clinician, working 2 days as a clinician in vaccinology and allergy, a day in each, and also at the Murdoch those 2 days. So I'm now in my, as a clinician-scientist with the Murdoch, so that would be post my first fellowship, the beginning of my second.
Well, thank you. They're lovely overviews of your careers. I'd really like now to involve you, the audience. So can we have our roving mic people? We have 2 mics out there, I think. Where's the second person? Yes, so please think about what you might like to know about. These guys are not that much older than you, so they can give you closer insights than the professors you've heard about from earlier today. Oh yes, thank you. There's one in the front row there.
Thank you all. Quite a general question, potentially to start off. Aiming at you moving overseas, how did you approach looking for opportunities when you had to move to a certain country, and how did you approach that?
Was that directed at me? Yes. So, I can first and then Jo. But essentially, the first time when we were going to the UK, I, at that point, wanted to do infectious diseases training. And I asked around the infectious disease consultants at the Children's Hospital. And it so happened that Nigel Curtis was from the UK and his mate was Andy Pollard, and that's sort of how things work. And Andy had an Oxford vaccine group there and was advertising for research fellows, so I applied and got a job as a research fellow. But I think that's often how things work. Ask around, don't be shy, and usually it's through a connection. And, you know, as I said, this is, you know, global world is actually very small, and, you know, now we're at our stage, you know, we've got friends and colleagues in many different areas around the world, and just seek, ask, yeah.
Justin, did you go overseas for a while?
No, I'm the unusual one up here, having well, been born overseas, as the accent gives away, but really sort of grown up here and done all my work here. So for me, when I got to my PhD, this was the big question, right? Would I go overseas? And for me at that time, similar to some of these guys, young family, decided that staying put here was a high priority, and so wanted to see about how the PhD that I did could leverage into work that could involve international work afterwards. And so for me, that's meant using Melbourne as a base for operational research training around the Pacific, for research in a number of different contexts, but always being based and having a home base back here in Melbourne. Yeah. Joe? Yeah.
I went overseas a bit earlier than Kirsten did, so I went overseas after my second year as a doctor, so intern and second year, so before I'd started advanced training. And that was because I think I wanted to just make sure I knew what I was going to embark on, as I alluded to before I jumped into the physician exam and the advanced training. And similarly, we had to find a place that my wife could work in, because you can work in the UK a lot easier as a doctor, even these days, and it's a lot harder to go to North America. So, you know, that was a practical thing. And then what I did was I knew that I was, because I was interested in public health and was wanting to do a master's, I was actually looking more at universities, not jobs so much, but picking unis I wanted to go to, and then casting it really wide with different scholarship programs, and was like, and saved up money, so I was ready to just go regardless. And I think that was actually the real key. I was really determined I wanted to go. So when I wrote those applications, they were really genuine and sincere, and it worked, and I managed to actually have some money saved, and we had a great time. But I think, as I mentioned, it was before family, and then when it got to PhD time and then postdoc time, it wasn't going to work. My wife was doing her geriatric for adult medicine training as well. She couldn't move, and we'd already had one kid when we were halfway through registrar training, and that just wasn't going to work either. And, you know, even those plans don't always work well. So when our first child was born, there were a whole lot of, you know, sickness type of issues and a whole lot of dramas, and now everything's great, but it wasn't necessarily like that, so it just wasn't going to work. So those things come up, the best laid plans, and suddenly, you know, life gets in the those things get in the way, and you just adapt a bit.
We have one in the here. That's people at the back. We have some questions for you. Okay.
Thank you for coming, everyone. My question is going to be about the concept of having first doing PhD in one of the areas and then doing our medical degrees, becoming clinician. So if you have any experience, because I know all of you has done the reverse pathway, but how it is going to be and what's the pros and cons to have first PhD and then do MBBS?
I might comment, I've had a lot of conversations with some of my surgical colleagues who did advanced degrees before they went to medical school. And I think observing what they've managed to achieve, and also a couple of physician colleagues as well who had a PhD before starting medical school, it really has helped, I think, most of those individuals to really accelerate their ability to do research once they have some clinical background and some skills. So they're starting training streets ahead of where the rest of us were, in terms of the sense of what the relevance of what we're learning, what we're doing clinically might be. They're thinking about clinical trials or research projects they could be doing right from the beginning in a way that I'm only just learning to think about. And so there are serious advantages to that. I think one disadvantage that I've observed is that often people do a PhD in a topic that they think is interesting to them. They enter medical school thinking, oh, I'm going to, I've done a PhD in neuroscience, I might become a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, and then they discover infectious disease or pediatrics, and they end up doing something completely different. And so what they find is that the network they had, which was very discipline specific, might actually not end up being the network they end up wanting or needing down the track. But what you never lose is the ability to think critically and independently that a higher degree really gives you. And I think that there's no wrong way of doing this. Every individual has a different path. And if you start out with that in your pocket, you're going to find huge advantages. But it's about finding those for yourself. I don't think there's a wrong way of doing it at all. I don't know if anyone else has.
I'm going to make a comment even though I'm not meant to. And that is because I was, earlier in the day we heard that, you know, you can do an MD PhD program and that they're being increasingly introduced here as well, which is the US model. And I think they really suffer if they want to be clinical researchers, because in order to be a clinical researcher, you have to be a clinician. And that only takes 13 years if you add your 6 years of medical school, or 5 years now, and then another sort of internship plus 6 years of specialising. You have 13 years to be a clinician, to then have the skills to go and be a clinical researcher. And I think it's much harder if you do the other way around, the basic. So if you do an MD PhD program, you combine the two and you go off and you do some basic science PhD, which is great for learning to think. And I think we would all say a PhD basically makes you think differently and think better, and I think it can make you a much better clinician. But I think the beauty about clinical research is that you have to bring your clinical skills to the table, and that helps you to ask the right clinical questions, the ones that matter and will make a difference. So I feel strongly that if you think you want to be a clinical researcher, it's better to do it later. And I was quite pleased to hear many of my colleagues earlier in the day say to you, do it later, even if you'll be poorer. Do others want to comment?
I tend to agree, but I guess we've got that bias from having done that as well. And I guess the old medical school model, when we were all undergraduates, probably made that the easier path back then. But I think that the other thing to consider is that in research you tend to go from one platform to the next, and you build on them over time. And the one thing about having a 10-year gap between your PhD and then coming back to try and continue your research career is that things change and you haven't built those networks, and you might not quite be in exactly the right space. And I have to say, sadly, I think the funding model in Australia doesn't really work yet, even though we're meant to take into account, you know, opportunity people have had to do research. It's much easier to go from PhD and a scholarship to your first postdoc fellowship to your next fellowship. And as soon as you sadly interrupt that a little bit, it's harder. And I think there's some inroads being made around family career disruptions, but it's still not quite right. But I think it's really hard for people whose PhD was 10 years earlier.
Yeah, my only comment was that, I mean, I did my PhD partway through my advanced training and sort of paused for a couple of years of research and then added in the advanced training as I was writing up. But I think some of my colleagues who have finished their physician training, they've had some benefit in that, you know, they're then a consultant and they can work a couple of sessions a week and help fund their research time, because we all know that PhD stipends are not very much, but, you know, having that clinician, mentality that you're working clinically, you're seeing real patients with real problems that you're trying to address, is also balanced by having that extra income coming in while you're, you know, trying to do PhD.
I just wanted to say as well, so a lot of people have asked me whether I was really nervous to interrupt my surgical training to go and live in the lab for 3 years and pipette all day. And I'm better at pipetting after 3 years of surgical training than I ever would have been before, so that's one thing. But the other thing to say is that, so I was really worried I was going to lose my surgical skills. So I did a little bit of on-call while I was doing my research full-time. But what I'm now able to report that, you know, having gone back to full-time surgical work, the muscle memory is there. So it might have taken me, 2 or 3 weeks to get back into the feeling of it, but you know, my hand ties have never been better. I feel like I'm in a better place as an operative surgeon, having had time away from it, and now I know how much I love it and how much I want to be there. I know that I have options. It's not the only pathway available to me, but I know that this is the thing I want to be doing most in the world, is actually hands-on helping patients, and that clarity has actually, I think it's made me a much better surgeon. So I don't think that people should be frightened of that. I think it's, have courage.
The only one thing to come back to your question is that if you want to be a researcher, do a PhD, if that's what you want to do. So we're talking about being clinician researchers or clinician scientists, but if you do your PhD first, you might end up following a whole different path. And don't think that you have to do that with medical school, definitely plan next. You might be an excellent researcher because you do it that way.
So, this is our third year of this meeting, and one of my favourite comments from our first year was a lass who had done a BMed Sci, and then so she's in the middle of her medical school, and then she'd gone off to start a PhD, and I think she was well into the PhD, and she said she'd really thought maybe she wouldn't bother finishing the medical degree. And she said that this day made her rethink that and realise it was worth finishing a medical degree, which is slightly different to what you were talking about. You were talking about before medicine. But I have to say, to be very frank, that life with a medical degree and a PhD is much easier to get grants and gives you more credibility unless you're just in very deep basic science. And we have a much easier time than your straight scientist. Would you all agree?
Definitely.
A whole different world.
Yeah.
So, time for another question. Oh, at the back there. That's great. Oh, yeah, there's also way up the back. Who was just
Hello?
Yep.
Oh, there we go. Thank you all very much for being here today. I've just got a general question for the panel. What would you say would be some of the pitfalls to avoid at a student level and going forward in your experiences?
What sort of pitfalls?
Or just generally, have you come across things that you would recommend that we avoid as students in research or even in just general medical practice as well?
How long have you got? I think that when in the context of thinking about becoming a clinician scientist, one of the biggest pitfalls is to embark on something like a PhD project because someone told you to. And I think that embarking on any aspect of your career direction because someone thinks you should or someone told you to, or often I have people ask me if they should do a PhD to help them get onto surgical training. Like, no. Like, do things because you want to do them, because you have a drive to do them from within yourself, not because you're trying to satisfy someone who's told you this is what they think you should do with your life. You have to have a plan that comes from a place of self-awareness and comes from an appreciation of what are your own strengths and what are your own desires and what's driving you and what gives you energy. If you're doing things for other reasons, that it will be so much harder. So I think that's like the number one pitfall I would warn you about.
Yeah, I think people probably more often get into trouble from the things that they don't try. I mean, I think this is a time for you to be actually exploring a whole bunch of different avenues and not being afraid that if you pursue something, it might shoot you in the foot. You know, I mean, run with the things that you're passionate about. I wound up with a master's degree in bioethics pretty early on, which I think it's fair to say has got to be amongst the least marketable degrees that you might pursue. But the reality is that I did it because I was passionate about it, and now, many years later, actually that's led me into all sorts of interesting research. That's really actually, because I did something just because I was interested in it, it led me to something that was a little bit quirky and actually gave me a skill set that some other people didn't have. And that pays off in the long run. I had dinner last night with somebody whose background was in archaeology, and just the fact that she's gone down a clinical pathway with something a little bit different up her sleeve, it's worth pursuing. And maybe you're not going to be a medical archaeologist for the rest of your life, but it gives you a string to your bow and a thing that actually makes life more interesting, and that pays off.
Kirsten?
No, I just echo what they have to say, that, just do what you enjoy, follow your dreams, stick your neck out, ask around, and make sure you just keep talking to people. And if an opportunity arises, just jump on it, because now is the time. Just take that path and see where it leads. And you're right, you can turn back, you can, come back to Melbourne, you can, do other things, to fall back on. But now's the time to go out there and explore and just launch yourself into something and give it a really good go. Yeah.
I also think you don't have to know you'll be good at it.
No.
Okay. And some of the people in the room will say, I'm going to do a PhD, I know I'm going to be a researcher. Well, that's fantastic for them. But you heard many of the people, like Shishich, got up there and said, I had no idea I was going to go into research. And I was the same. And I thought I certainly wouldn't be any good at it. And I think that you just don't know until you give it a go. So just take life's opportunities. Up the back.
First off, I'd like to thank the panel. My question generally regards, in your training and careers essentially, were there any books or resources that you guys found particularly useful or formative in making these critical career decisions, I guess?
There are a couple of thinkers who write long books but also do nice little TED Talks, which are digestible. There are a couple that I sort of come back to. I really appreciate the writing and the work of Atul Gawande. He's been very helpful in my thinking about the meaning of surgical work, but also the importance of checklists in patient safety, and that sort of thing really grounds my practice and the way I do ward rounds, the way I set up for operations, everything. So that's really helped me to help my patients and make me feel purposeful with what I do. And another I would recommend is Abraham Burgess, who talks and writes quite eloquently about the importance of human touch in the clinical encounter, the dangers of the eye patient, where we're treating the data and not the patient. We're treating the scan and the blood results and not the actual human being. We're not laying our hands on our patients. We're not seeing them. We're not meeting them. And they're not benefiting from that healing encounter. And he also wrote a novel which I heavily recommend called Cutting for Stone. You'll need tissues towards the end. I'll leave that there.
Yeah, lots. I mean, and that's the first thing. Read a lot and read widely, and don't be bound by the medical literature. Read Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger. Listen to Krista Tippett and read what she's writing through the On Being project, which is just a fantastic exploration, which recently interviewed Atul Gawande actually around how his experience of spirituality as a person who's been brought up across 3 different continents and in multiple different faith contexts makes a difference in the way that he thinks about public health and dying. Read great literature. This is very much an area that I think is really underdeveloped in medicine. And I love people like, say, Paul Farmer, who's a great hero of mine, who can bring together some of these things. I mean, Paul, for people who don't know him, is a medical anthropologist who does a lot of work in drug-resistant TB, particularly in Haiti and some of the ex-Russian states, and has just done some lovely and gentle and careful work about what it means to think about healthcare in some of these contexts, how we think about liberation and freedom and what human thriving looks like. These are the big questions that sit under all of our clinical and our research paradigms, and actually all of these bits of literature are great ways to tap into that. So I'll stop talking now. There's still time.
Thanks for speaking to us today. Just a question, as a medical student, if we are interested in dabbling in research ourselves but aren't sure what kind of area of medicine we're thinking of doing in the future, what's your best advice for that?
Choose ambiguous titles for your articles. Sorry, other people will have better advice, but.
I often do get emails, we probably all do, from students wanting to do research projects, and I think it's really challenging, and I wonder sometimes whether sometimes you're better off trying to just focus on your medical studies when you're a student and enjoy everything else you're doing and have a broad life and read as much as these two clearly do, rather than necessarily trying to squish something in, which we talked before about how it will be a long time probably after your early clinical years where you're busy in a hospital before you really have to leap into more serious research. So I think outside of a formal, say, honours year or BMed Sci year, it's really hard to spend enough time to develop really, I think, useful research skills. I'm not saying that can't always work, but I often see that the students who come along because they've got 1 hour a week are very different from those we get for the whole year for honours, and they just can't quite get as much out of it. That's my observation.
Yeah, I mean, most of medical students now have your opportunity to do your MDRP or your research project time, and that's built into your medical school years. And I think that is actually fantastic, where you actually have to, you know, find a topic and you have people willing to support you through that. And you do get immersed in a group in that experience, and, you know, you get to critique or learn how to critique journal articles, and you have to write a project, and you have to actually do something very containable with that time. So I actually think that most of the medical schools now, I'm right, aren't I? Monash and Melbourne both have this time set aside for you to have some exposure. It doesn't matter that that exposure is not going to be anything related to where you're going to be in 10, 15 years. As you can see, you know, it could be in, you know, anything, and then you move completely in a different field. But just to get some experience and exposure in that, I think is a fabulous opportunity.
And I think, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, from a surgery-specific perspective, if you're thinking about a career in surgery, a lot of people think, oh, I know I need to have some research on my CV to get onto surgical training. I better get that done. It'd be great if I could get that out of the way. I want to caution you that if that's a pathway that you're planning on, you need to actually familiarise yourself with what it is that the surgical training program you're interested in actually will be looking at. Because one of the things many people don't realise is that for most training programs, there's a time limit on when your research could be done. So if you did a research project and got a fabulous publication in Nature halfway through medical school, good on you. It still wouldn't count if you're applying for, say, general surgery training 6 years later, because it would have kind of like expired. So you need to be aware that if you're just stacking up your papers now because you think you're this like a little insurance policy for the future, nobody's really fussed that it's in Nature. It's just it's too old. And so I think that the advice about focusing in medical school on really making sure you're learning, how am I going to look after my patients? What are the good basics? What are the generic skills I need to have about recognizing which ones are sick and which things I need to escalate, as opposed to, you know, developing this massive research portfolio. I think it's important to realize the fundamentals that have to come first. I wouldn't discourage you from being involved in research projects, but realize that the time for big projects is probably a bit later, and they'll mean a lot more to you once you have more clinical context to understand why you're trying to answer a certain question.
Can I quickly say that sounds like yet another college rule, which sounds a bit dumb, because most people would think that a Nature paper is pretty damn good in the last most of your career.
Sure, but the point is that if the reason why you're undertaking research is to fulfill future requirements, then you actually need to make the effort to find out what those are. Because, you know, there's a lot of rumor that goes on, I hear all kinds of hilarious stories about what it is that surgical training is about. And I'm like, no, like you have to read up on things yourself, do your own research, find out for yourself what the requirements will be, and cut through all that sort of gossip. It's a really important precaution.
One just general thing that I was going to say to that too was, I think if you are thinking about how you get into the research field, do remember to think broadly about it, because there's a lot of ways in that don't involve, you know, can you set up your own randomized control trial as a student? No, you're not going to do that, right? That's okay. But maybe there's an interesting letter to the editor you can write maybe there's a systematic review that you can be part of. So we've had students who participate in that area. There are some smaller projects that you might do, and they all give you expertise in different skills. Sometimes we've had students rotating through with us who've said that, I'm going to take on revising a protocol for some hospital thing, and so they've gone through the effort of contributing to that. There are all different ways that you can be involved in a clinical research activity more broadly that help to shape the way you think about it, but also can produce some useful outputs. So it is worth just thinking a bit more broadly than just, can I design a trial and publish it?
Yes, Ruth, you already spoke on this. I was just wondering if I get the other speaker's opinion on it from like a non-surgery point of view. So for those of you that interrupted your med or practice or whatever to go and do other degrees like your bioethics and politics, did you ever find coming back to it was hard, or do you have any tips or anything on coming back to medicine after doing something that's kind of unrelated in a way?
So I think that it's actually pretty easy, mostly because one of the advantages of most of the early junior doctor years being 12-month contracts, it's pretty easy to disappear for a year at that early stage and come back. So I had no trouble after second year doing that because it was the right time to then come back as a third year HMO. It's when you start to prepare for your physician exam, which usually is the fourth year. So if you pick the right time for the path you're going to follow, you can do that. And I think for my colleagues who, for example, gone overseas for PhD, around that PhD time or whatever, it's a well-worn path. So I think you can come back pretty easily too.
I guess the only other thing to add to that is that it's actually some advantage too, that particularly around transitional moments, like, when Joe goes away and does some study or some research in another country, there's a period of time that you're away and then you come back, and you come back in a way that's you're seen a little bit differently. You've brought back a new set of skills. So actually there's something quite valuable about that transition and re-entry sometimes too.
I think it's quite hard sometimes to actually make the leap. I remember at the end of my first year of paediatrics, and I'd just been given a senior resident position for the following year, and that was not a given. There was only, 2/3 of the people that got that next year. And I turned around and said, no, I'm off for a year. And, I remember thinking, will they ever let me back? And you do feel like that because, you're taking a leap of faith, going and doing something awesome, which you really want to do and you're passionate about. But, you think, gosh, I was meant to be doing this and I'm just going to be plateauing for a year. But you come back and you're actually fully fired up and determined, and they look at you going, wow, she's gone and done this really cool thing. And, you can tell them and share about it and, have this experience. And I think you are the richer for it. They are the richer for it. And you come back motivated to then, get into your study and get through your physician exams in a way that if you stay on that treadmill, you get a bit sometimes tired.
Broken.
Hello. Hi. I was wondering whether you could describe the pathway to become a surgeon, and when would you suggest doing a PhD?
So I think the pathway is long, and if you do a PhD, you make it longer. So sometimes I think of what I've done as a series of poor life choices, but I think I would do it again. So for me, it was 4 years of being a junior doctor, so intern, then resident year, then a year where I transitioned from being a resident to an unaccredited registrar, then another year as a full-time as a unaccredited registrar. I got onto training, so then my first year of training was my 5th year as a doctor, which is probably slightly earlier than the average for surgical training, certainly for neurosurgery training. Neurosurgery training is 6 years long, although it's now becoming more competency-based, which means that in some instances it might become shorter, and for some people it might become longer. Most surgical training programs are between 5 and 7 years. So pediatric surgery 7, orthopedics and plastics, ENT, vascular are 5. General surgery is 4, but after the 4 years, most people do a 2-year fellowship in something else, like colorectal or Hep Bill, that kind of thing. So there are no short versions of surgical training, and it takes a while to get on at the beginning. Doing a PhD, at the time when I started neurosurgery training, there was the option to have a year of my training as a research year, and I chose to do that, which meant that I was only actually interrupted as a trainee for 2 of the 3 years that I was a full-time researcher, which means that provided I pass my exam next year and actually hand in my manuscript, I'll have done a PhD and training in 8 years from the beginning of that, but that's after 4 years of already being a doctor. That's as fast as anyone could probably do it, I think. So it's a very long journey. And so most of my friends I went through medical school with are long finished. They're consultant physicians, they've owned their own GP practices, they're running radiology services. So you might feel that you're lagging behind, but it's a very good thing to do because you have the best job in the hospital.
I just wanted to remind you that it's a journey, not a sprint. You know, just there is no race, and you just take the most of the opportunities, and your race, your journey will be different to someone else's. And you know, your PhD may take longer, but it may be more interesting, or it might take you to where you want to be, which is a completely different direction to the one that stayed at home or did whatever. So yeah, I'd caution you to worry about the number of years. Don't worry that it's going to take you 15 years or whatever. I had no idea how long it would take me when I started. You know, I thought I was going to be, you know, an academic clinician, you know, in X number of years, and it took me X plus 10, but it doesn't matter. You know, I'm happy and fulfilled, and I have 4 beautiful children and a great partner. So, you know, you don't know where it's going to be or how long it's going to take you.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. Having come into the situation of having a PhD and postdoc training and just starting medical school now, and not following the traditional pathway, what suggestions or recommendations would you have?
So your question, just to clarify, you're in medical school now and you want some suggestions on how to become a clinician-scientist? Or?
Yeah, so basically, if you already have developed a research background, you have if you have a PhD and postdoctoral training, there's a lot of challenges that you've pointed out. Yeah. Now, what is there any suggestions if someone like myself is in that situation, to ensure that, you know, the research skills and the background isn't basically put to waste?
So I guess the first thing you probably, please jump in everyone, because I don't think there's the right answer. The first thing is probably to enjoy your medical school and work out what areas you like. And I hope, if it all lines up for you, that the area you've already researched in is the area that you most enjoy. Because I think Ruth earlier alluded to the fact that you can end up in or maybe Ingrid as well, you can end up actually in a very different aspect of clinical medicine by the time you finish medical school, done an internship, and even at that point start to choose advanced training. And that may be 3, 4, 5 years from where you are right now. So you've got, I think, plenty of time, no rush, and you just need to work out that aspect of clinical medicine that you've already had a bit of research exposure to is really the best fit for you, because that's what you've got for the rest of your life that you're going to sort of work more and more in. So make sure you get the right area. And it can change, and your skills will still put you in a position where you can leap ahead quicker. But, you know, you'll just deal with that, I guess, when you get there.
I think it's quite difficult to, I mean, some people who I've known in my cohorts who've been in that situation have kind of got into medical school with this implicit feeling in the back of their head that they needed to somehow keep up their research as they go through medical school. And I don't know anyone who's managed to do that. I just think you need the time to focus on being in medical school rather than, you know, doing that thing. You know, one of my best friends who was in that situation had a PhD in ghrelin and obesity-related research, and she went through medical school, and now, years down the track, basically has gone into adventure medicine, and she's trained as a rural and remote emergency department practitioner, and she's doing nothing whatever, but she's very happy. And
it doesn't work with obese people.
Has nothing to do with, there's, you know, not too many you know, rural and remote expeditioning obesity research for her to get involved in now. No, but I just mean, you know, this was a transitional period of life, and You go to medical school and everyone starts on day one, and you will use everything that comes with you in your background, but maybe it's also an opportunity to do something different. And I think this is the time to give yourself permission to ask those questions.
Hi, thank you very much for talking to us. I was just wondering, for those who have gone overseas, what are some personal and professional hoops that you've had to jump through in order to firstly practice and secondly work as a scientist?
Well, for me personally, I had to do my BMC, is that what it was called? In the UK, GMC. And that was fine because I'd just done the FRACP in Melbourne, so that's to work in the UK, but it's a reciprocal type arrangement in the UK, so it's very much easier to work as a clinician in the UK. And to work as a research fellow or in a research role, really you just need an appointment or a job, so that will give you a visa. So the UK experience for me, that was very straightforward. Moving to the US was very, very different, and I was obviously a number of years post FRACP, and there was no way under the sun that I was going to go back and study to do those horrendous exams for the US to be a clinician over there. So I chose to be a researcher only for that period in my life, and that was fun, but I missed being a clinician. I did, but we knew that it was only going to be a couple of years because that's sort of what we needed to do. Yeah.
My experience was at a different stage where it was easy. You just enrol as a student, and you get a student visa. So completely different type of experience. Yours.
Hello. Hi, I'm Kirsten. You referred to before the importance of sticking your neck out and how far that's gotten you. I mean this quite seriously. I'm just not sure how to word it. How do you go about doing this, like contacting people to seek opportunities to get yourself out there without being weird?
Yeah, good question.
I don't know the answer to that. I think, yeah.
Don't worry about being weird. It's fine.
It never occurred to me that I was being weird, I'm sorry. But I guess I was in the predicament that we were going to the UK, and does anyone know anybody, that I could get in touch with to see what's out there? Was me just sticking my neck out going, have you got any contacts? Who do you recommend I get in touch with? Is there anything that you know of or people you know of? That was, for me, it just made sense that I would ask people in, the ID space, and that's what happened, yeah.
I might just add a bit from the other perspective. So I get emails all the time, I'm sure we all do, from people seeking to come and work with us. And there are the sort of generic emails where you can tell that your name font is different to the rest of the email, and that's ignore immediately.
Cut and paste.
And then there are the emails that say, they say your name, but you see they have no idea what you do. They've just come from veterinary school in Iraq or something, and they really haven't looked at it. And so there are lots of those, and there are lots of really shoddy ones. And the ones that are real jump out a million miles. So they say, dear Professor Sheffer, I'm really interested in the genetics of epilepsy. I've been following your work. This is what I've done. I've done X years. I'm a paediatric neurologist or an adult neurologist. I would love to come and work for a year or 2 years or do a PhD. And many of them, for our group, will bring their own funding. So we typically run between 4 and 6 international fellows at any time. They typically come for a minimum of a year. They may come for 3 years and may do a PhD. There are big problems with that because a PhD at Melbourne Uni costs a fortune if you're a foreign student. And we are very fortunate because we get these highly talented, very senior neurologists, and they develop their own critical mass of friendships. So they all come to this country that's a million miles from wherever they live, and we might have an Italian, a German, a Canadian, a Thai, a Chinese person, and so we have this like United Nations. And it's fantastic. They end up being friends for life. And every year at the American Epilepsy Society or the International Epilepsy Congress, we run a fellows dinner for our past fellows. And now I've been around for a while, so we have 25 years of fellows. And I always forget that this fellow doesn't know this fellow because they were 5 years apart. They weren't there at the same time. So they have life-changing experiences, as I did when I went to the UK for 2 years. So it's not weird at all. It's perfectly normal. But a good letter, the email has to be a really good email, and it has to have your CV with it, and it has to state what you want and what you're hoping to get and what funding you have or what funding you've looked into. If you seriously want to come and work with me, you seriously have to try and find your own funding, because we just don't have funding for fellows from around the world. So, you know, it's all about your homework and doing it well. But we love those fellows. You know, I had a Canadian fellow who actually was here 2 years ago, and I got him to be on this panel because I wanted him to talk about it from the other side of the world. In 2 years, he wrote 15 papers. Pretty good.
Can I say it's not weird? And I also think that that's what your professors here are for, to help you a bit. I don't know what you think, Ingrid, but asking a professor here who they think you should write to, and you know, you've just heard some great advice on how to write the letter yourself, but at the same time, contacts here know people overseas, and that helps a lot. And
That's exactly right.
And professors like being asked, you know, for their opinion and their recommendation. If they like you and they want to help you, they see that as part of their job.
And they'll send an introduction on your behalf. And both of the times I went overseas, it was my professors at home who introduced me to their colleagues.
Yeah, that's normal. We are highly connected. With any senior epileptologist in the world, I will know them. And I can sort of say, this person's good, take them, and they will.
Yeah, that's right.
Hello.
Hello. I've just got two questions. I think I'm talking several years out of medical school. The first question is, did you undertake a full-time PhD or a part-time PhD? And I see a lot of colleagues starting PhDs, but not as many finishing them. Do you have any tips or suggestions in making sure that you can complete the PhD you set out to start?
I did a part-time PhD. Because I started a PhD with a child, and I've worked part-time for 14 years. And I don't see any problem with that. I think if you have a project and a PhD that you love and that you're doing for the reasons that this is an area that you are really interested in, you will finish it. So make sure you're embarking on the project that you want to do, which is what Ruth mentioned earlier.
I think clinician-scientists or clinicians are more likely to finish their PhDs than non-clinicians. So I wouldn't worry about that. If you want to do it, you'll finish it. And I also think that clinician PhD candidates are more flexible about what part-time and full-time means. So most of my colleagues, apart from those who've got family reasons, will do them full-time. But full-time means that you're still doing some clinical work related to it. It's partly financial, it's partly because it's starting to get you into the academic unit or the hospital unit that you want to work in, and you start off covering people's leave, and then they give you a more permanent, you know, half day or full day work, and that's completely fine, and it helps your PhD. And eventually you start seeing patients in the clinics that all relate to your PhD, and it just transitions for a lovely end of PhD into, hopefully, a few more bits of work. And so I think full-time for almost all my colleagues, apart from those who were already working part-time for family. And most people finish. That's my gut feeling.
Well, they are more likely. Statistically, they are more likely to finish, but as to why. Yeah. But why?
Enjoyment? Career? I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't need that. I would say that clinicians who undertake a PhD really, really want to do it, and I think that a lot of science graduates fall into a PhD because it's the next thing you do after an honours, and you don't necessarily know what you're going to do, or you don't necessarily have a a job in mind or have a job available. So you just keep going on that journey of doing a PhD. Whereas a clinician makes an active decision to, reduce their salary and launch and embark on something because they love it, because they want to do it. So I do think that there are differences. Yeah.
One of the things I noticed at the WeHi was that the people who were at the same stage in their PhD as what I was, who weren't clinicians, that at first I was thinking, oh, these are my peers, but they really weren't, because they were at least a decade younger than me. And so they were all in share houses and there's a very different dynamic. They were living a very different life than someone who'd been a neurosurgery registrar, working 80 hours a week for 3 years at that stage. It was a very different approach to work and to life, and different life stage, I think. And so part of that is, you really want to be finished with this bit because you want to get on with the next bit. And I think there are different motivations altogether. And I would say that one of the things that has been very helpful for me is the friendship and connections that I've had with other people who are in that same space, who are clinician PhD students. And some of my bestest friends, I guess, when in that period, have been people in the same boat as me, and they've all been different kinds of specialists than me. But that's really been very helpful because we actually realised that we were each other's peers, and we could actually help each other out with some of the challenges that you start wondering, oh, am I becoming a crap clinician? I don't feel like a very good scientist either. How am I going to manage those feelings? And we're all terribly hard on ourselves and very high achieving. So how do we reconcile all of that? And the best way to do it is in community with people that you can trust and support each other. I think that's really part of making that work.
Hello. Hi. So today is entirely about science, and I understand that medicine is increasing about science, but there's popular saying that medicine is both an art and a science. And I understand that, Joseph and Justin have degrees in humanities. And I personally have an undergrad in history. My question is, how has a degree in humanities or the arts helped you in clinical practice and clinical research? The others can also reply too, but
I have a political science degree too.
Oh, okay.
Look, I think I don't want to just sit up here and wax lyrical for long periods of time, but I think first and foremost, this is about how we be human together, actually, rather than how we. This is not about. This is not about what tool do I need to get my paper into a journal that's an impact factor higher or whatever. This is about how we be human together, and clinical research and clinical medicine and research, these are just fields in which we're human together. And the humanities gives us a lens to understand both why that's important, how people have failed to respect it properly in the past, and how we maintain our sanity while we try to do it well. So those are the big picture kind of things that I think are worth hanging on to. In terms of the very specifics, well, that's very specific, right? What's something specific? I chair an international research ethics committee now, and that provides ethics oversight for countries that don't have their own infrastructure to help mentor and oversee their projects for research ethics approval and so forth. And it's a very specific task I do that I wouldn't do if I didn't have a qualification in ethics. But everybody will take something from their toolbox and use it in a different way. But it's those big picture things that I keep gravitating back to.
I think I alluded to the fact that I did it because I was sort of not 100% sold on necessarily this clinical pathway. So I was sitting on the fence, right? So I don't think it was designed to make me a better doctor at that time. But it's interesting when I look back, the narrative fits really well, that I wanted to learn more about how you can implement change at the population level, and you have to understand how policy is made and how systems can change if you want to not just treat the person who's sitting in front of you, but treat the whole community. Because you can have great interventions and great science, but we know not all great science gets implemented. And there's lots of examples in infectious diseases, because infectious diseases, I think, is probably the epitome of the sort of areas in medicine that straddles politics and society, because infections don't respect class or race or status necessarily. So, you know, they affect everybody. So, and all of those determinants of health come into it. So, look, understanding humanities helps me understand those things, but I didn't do it for that reason. I'm being honest. I did it because I was sitting on the fence.
Yeah, so I think I did political science and also a zoology degree like 100 years ago. And there were some more animals there. Some have gone extinct. And I know, I'm so cheerful, right? But at the time, the joke was that I wanted to study all of the animals. But I think that actually political science degree is like really helpful in medicine, because it's such a political space. And it's helped in all sorts of ways. So I spent a couple of years being the chair of the trainee association for the College of Surgeons, and being able to like hold my own in a council discussion. I mean, all the time I spent doing really, really nerdy things like debate club and like Model UN have really actually paid off. So like it's like revenge of the nerds. And actually, because of my work with ICANN, I got to give an address at the actual UN. And because I was a resident at the time at the Alfred when I did that, I was drawing on my experience from the bedside. And it was such a convergence point, because I think our strongest voice of advocacy for it is from the bedside. And so you're able to let the clinical work that you do inform your understanding of the world and your voice into the world. And the training you might have from other disciplines, you bring that to the bedside too, and your patients are the better for it. The amount of conversations I've been able to have with particularly patients who come from overseas, who've had terrible experiences as refugees fleeing oppression and disaster and so forth, understanding the context they've come from has helped me treat their back pain better, figure out whether they need an operation or whether they need just someone to listen. So nothing is ever wasted. And if you commit to letting your journey be one that's guided with integrity, you'll find the connections. They will become clear to you.
Hello. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for your wonderful insights today. My question related to, so I'm a junior doctor at the moment. I have areas of interest, but I have literally no research experience. Do you guys have any tips for just beginning to get involved in research?
The first thing I wrote that got published was a case report. And I think that certainly in surgery, it's a really good starting place. So if you find something that's weird and wonderful, it's a patient with two conditions that are both rare and they're overlapping, or someone who's got some absolutely astonishing photograph from something that happened during an operation. These things are stories that can be written up, and it helps you learn how to prepare a manuscript, how to get the figures right, how to learn about the editing process, the fact that you're going to write 4 or 5 or 6 drafts of something, and how to submit an article for publication, and then how to deal with feedback from the editors. All of that journey, it's a lot easier when it's a 3 or 4 page manuscript instead of a 57-page manuscript. And it's a good place to start. So I think for my medical students and residents, that's what I recommend to them. And if you let the people on your team know that that's what you're interested in, they can help you find an appropriate case to start working on that with and mentor you through that journey. I think that's one place to start.
Oh, just if you have an interest area already, I would start talking to the people in that area who are clinician-scientists and, ask them if they could mentor you. Ask them if you can go along to their research group meeting, which often, they'll have weekly or weekly, and then you really understand what's going on and what people are talking about, and you'll start to think, oh, I'm really interested in that. Oh, but I'm not going to be a lab person. I want to do a clinician, project, an epi project, and you start to it starts to become obvious, but I would start to see if you can attach yourself to a clinician researcher or a couple of researchers, and they might be people doing PhDs in that area, or they might be the professor, but you can get a little bit immersed and just hang around and see what's happening. Yeah, that would be my tips.
We need some at the front here too.
Hey guys, I'm interested in any sort of cathartic experience, insights, perspectives, whatever that you might have gained from your time as researchers that you wouldn't necessarily have appreciated as clinicians. Any comment?
I really appreciate the change of pace, moving back and forwards between the two. So one of the things that is often true in clinical medicine is that it's very immediate. We have successes and failures that are felt, but they're often felt in relatively short periods of time. And research is generally over a much longer period of time. And so both of those things have great strengths, but done alongside each other, I find the combination really valuable. There'll be some research program that I'm working on which is long and difficult and goes on over months or years, and it's really refreshing to drop into a clinical scenario and do some things that actually have some immediate gratification and you can feel that you're helping people. But sometimes when you're just doing clinical work, that can get draining, and it's nice to be able to step back from that and think about something bigger picture. So I find the interplay between those two things one really helpful aspect.
For me, I'm an outpatient clinician. That's, I see people in the room at the hospital, and it's very much a one-on-one experience, and you get the immediate reward from, helping that child and that family and those parents, and that's very exciting and immediate, and you come home going, oh, I've helped 12 people today, or children. But I think for me, the research buzz comes from you are working in a team, and you are all working together with a common goal to try and answer this clinical question so that you can better help those people in the clinic. And not just those people in the clinic, but in everyone's clinics and around the world in those clinics. And you're working towards something bigger, and you're also working as a team. And I love working with people. And when you're in a room, you've only got that one-on-one. But when you're in your research group meeting, you're bouncing ideas around and you're flying, what the latest evidence is in here and how can we integrate that and what can we do differently in our lab and our epi team. And I think that working together in that environment is so rich and rewarding and stimulating. And in the clinical side, I get the immediate buzz, but I don't get that shared goal. Yeah.
Joseph?
Just one small comment, because I think they're great responses. I think as a researcher, you see that actually in clinical practice, what we all do is really variable quite a lot, even though we might all think we're trying to practice the same way. But, a lot of decisions we make and the process of making decisions in a hospital or in a clinical environment is really, focused individually, and you bring in every influence you have, but you sort of spit out an answer. When you're trying to do that as a researcher, you try to sometimes collect data on all these patients and, record people who've all gone through the hospital, through your unit, auditing for X, Y, or Z, and you realise how rubbish we are at recording and doing things by best practice. So I think actually as a researcher, my insight is to think, I really should always make sure that if this is important in practice and evidence says it is, then I should make sure every time someone comes in, I focus on that aspect of their clinical care, which otherwise, if you're not thinking like a researcher and where will that be, where will you record it, it just gets left off.
Lots of times we've heard today how important it is picking the right PhD supervisor. So I wondered if you might each tell us how you picked your PhD supervisor and whether you'd pick them again.
That's such a good question. And I think it feeds into a question earlier about PhD completion, and I think that a common thread in people who've had a real struggle to get to the end, one of the themes is perhaps not having the greatest relationship with the supervisor, and maybe that's just because you're not handing in your drafts. But I think for me, my PhD supervisor was someone who I'd met with to get advice on sort of where to go forward, and I didn't realise until sort of the 11th hour that having that person as a supervisor would even be an option. And in some ways, he was picked for me. So Tony Burgess is a sort of giant in the field of epidermal growth factor receptor, and I just kind of got told, I think you should do a project with him, and I got in touch with him about that, and So it was literally about 3 weeks before I started that he became my supervisor. And that was a change from plans A and B. So it's now the plan C supervisor, and I'm really grateful for that. I would definitely choose him again. I think the fact that he's not a clinician and therefore is always available in the lab and answers his emails and isn't stuck somewhere is really great. And I think people think they want a clinician for a supervisor, but I don't think I'm necessarily, I think that has its benefits, but I think it has some significant downsides. So I'm very grateful that I have a real, like, proper scientist looking after me and my scientific education and keeping me in line. I think I've been very fortunate.
I've had 3 supervisors, 2 infectious diseases doctors and 1 gastroenterologist for a hepatitis C PhD, and the main supervisor probably steered me to the others, and I picked her because in Melbourne she was the infectious diseases doctor doing most of this sort of hepatitis C work that I was interested in, and I'd come across her during my registrar years and sort of had worked with her a little. So I think that's how that entree came in, and we then strategically picked the other person in Australia who's doing that same thing. They happen to be Sydney based, so they would co-supervise me from Sydney, and those 2 people are still the 2 people in Australia doing all of this hepatitis C elimination work. So they're still, 7 years on, the right people, and I would still pick them again. And the third person who was a co-supervisor came on because he was younger, closer to the experience of having just done his PhD, and he was off at Duke doing a postdoc and had just had a paper in Nature all around Hep C. He's now a professor director in another unit in Melbourne. He's the gastroenterologist. So I would definitely pick all 3, but I think you need the right first person to sort of give you that sense of who the other should be, and perhaps your current clinical boss who actually verifies that you're getting the right advice from your PhD supervisor, because sometimes they have their own interests, but I think everyone agreed that I had a good team, and I agree it worked out well.
For me, I just had 2 supervisors. So I was in Oxford, so the head of the Oxford vaccine group was my PhD supervisor. And I would call my primary supervisor, but because I didn't want to do an overseas PhD with the exorbitant fees, I did my PhD through the University of Melbourne. So my primary supervisor was based in Melbourne, and that was the contact who put me in touch with him. And it wasn't his content area, but I can tell you I did my PhD in Oxford using, my, Oxford supervisor to, guide me, steer me, encourage me, in the project. And my Melbourne supervisor did very little until I came home and I needed to write the thing up. And he was fantastic, because I think this goes, throughout life. And we haven't spoken about having mentors and having different sorts of people. And this is where you have, someone who's very heavily involved in the content of your PhD and someone who just knows how to write a PhD, how to do your chapters, how to frame them, how to edit them, to get that done. And I think that, throughout life you need different people who can serve different purposes, supporting you and helping you through that. So that's how mine worked. And I'd definitely choose them both again, absolutely. Yeah.
Look, I probably really just want to echo most of what we've said here, but maybe specifically I'd say it's worth emphasising that I think we're all thinking less about who my PhD supervisor is these days and more about what kind of supervisory team do I need? So that this is just the structure that most universities are going towards, and there's really good reasons for it. But as clinician researchers, I think one thing that's often a little bit different is that we, it's a generalization, but I think we're usually much more likely to be bringing a specific project or something, a specific area of work into the PhD rather than necessarily some people have come through from an undergraduate model. And that means that you can think much more strategically about you've heard from these guys about who the people are that they need to be able to accomplish that. And remember too that this can change. So people add supervisors all the time. It's somewhat more difficult emotionally and relationally sometimes to drop supervisors, but that happens too when it needs to. And really the PhD should be a process that you're steering. And so thinking about the team that you want was really the approach that I took. In my case, I had someone who was just fantastic in terms of the skills that she had that needed to inform particularly the mathematical modelling side of my project, but She was not long out of her own PhD and had not supervised a PhD as the primary person before. And so I also put someone quite senior on who actually wasn't very involved in my process, but was a fantastic mentor to my real main supervisor. And that's really important, you know, in terms of the processes of getting this through, making sure that university procedures are followed, all those kinds of things that need to happen. We need to do it at every stage. So I think we just think about the teams we need.
Well, thank you. Those questions were fabulous, but I think our panel was even more fabulous. So please join me in thanking them all.